was our territory. It was never part of, as I said, it was never part of Mauritius. Liz Truss gets cornered by the Mauritian Prime Minister and agrees to open negotiations. And I to this day, I've got no idea why. There isn't a case for handing it over. The issue is the International Court of Justice has given an advisory ruling to the effect that we should surrender the islands.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Off the Record. And the topic of the day is, of course, the Chagos Islands. The deal, the controversial deal that was apparently initially suggested by the former Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, but it was actually kind of ignored by the Tory government. It was brought back by the new cabinet led by Keir Starmer. A lot of speculations that when the Labour Party went into Downing Street, the civil servant just said, hey, we already have this ready. Do you want to do it? And Starmer said yes. But we have to talk about obviously the consequences, politically speaking, and of course geopolitically when it comes to the United States, the role of the US in this with the new president. And we have a special guest to discuss this with us, Conservative Home's Henry Hill. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good. So obviously you're close to the Westminster bubble. What is going on with this nonsense? Firstly, for those who are not familiar, can you explain why this was even on the table from the British side's perspective, the British state and the civil service, and obviously the Mauritius never actually had the Chagos Islands. Why did they think this would be a good idea?
Yeah, okay, so very brief potted history of Diego Garcia. Archipelago in the Indian Ocean, one of the most remote archipelagos in the world, not inhabited before Britain colonized it. Previously was basically administered by the British colony of Mauritius, or the British colonial authorities in Mauritius, just because that was the closest British colony available, right? But it was never part of the Mauritian nation, if you want to call it that. Anyway, fast forward to the 1960s, winds of change are blowing. Mauritius gains independence, but before that happens, Britain carves off the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius, and also a little bit of territory from Seychelles, which we since returned, and made it into the British Indian Ocean territory because Diego Garcia, the main island in the Chagos archipelago, incredibly valuable naval base, right? Actually helped to save British ships during World War II because it was so remote the Japanese didn't know it existed. Anyway, the crucial thing is we paid Mauritius off for this. There was the Lancaster House Agreement in the 1960s, and we gave Mauritius a bunch of cash to just be fine with it. Anyway, after that, a few decades later, Mauritius revives its claim, and it keeps banging this drum, and we essentially ignore it, right? Because we can. We signed a deal with them. It was our territory. It was never part of, as I said, it was never part of Mauritius, and that ticks on for decades. And even New Labour were pretty good on this, to be honest. They formally said, I think it was quite funny, they formally said, we'll return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius once we no longer have a use for it. And then someone FOI'd the Foreign Office, and they said, we cannot envision circumstances in which we will no longer have a use for this base. Fast forward to now. What happens is, as far as we can tell, Liz Truss, not James Cleverly, Liz Truss gets cornered by the Mauritian Prime Minister and agrees to open negotiations. And I to this day, I've got no idea why, right? I assume it's a combination of her being completely ignorant of the issue, getting ambushed at a thing, and then just being really bad at small talk because she's Liz Truss. So she just kind of says yes out of social awkwardness. Cleverly has to negotiate the deal, and he gets a lot of stick for this, but maybe he should have resigned, but it was Truss who decided to go for it. And it was previously Johnson who'd indicated that we might be open to doing negotiations. Eventually, Lord Cameron kills this off. Labour comes in, as you say, and they revive the deal. Now, what's the problem? What's the case? There isn't a case for handing it over. Right. The issue is the International Court of Justice has given an advisory ruling to the effect that we should surrender the islands. Now, to a lot of people, when we're talking about courts, everyone seems to think that Britain is in the dock at the Old Bailey. A criminal or a suspect at the Old Bailey does not get to decide whether or not they are bound by the court's decision. But the ICJ is different, right? It's an international mediation court. And crucially, according to its own very explicit rules, the ICJ can only issue binding determinations when both parties have agreed to mediation. Right? It's like if you and I had a dispute at work, you couldn't call in ACAS and get ACAS to deliver a ruling if I wasn't involved. So what happened instead is Mauritius went on its own to the ICJ and it got an advisory ruling, which means nothing internationally. And yet there are people in this Labour government who seem to think that because of that, we should hand over this base.
Okay, well, that's insane. So, I mean, you're correct in terms of these entities. They're more like referees rather than obviously the Old Bailey. But it's kind of obvious, but it's still an important question because one, about the role of the US. Yes, we understand we're allies, and actually, I mean, my own biased opinion is that I don't want to give it away for obvious reasons. But how can the US be so involved in this that as a apparently senior partner in this special relationship, we can use President Trump to come and stop the deal? What do we need him to stop the deal?
I mean, he could. The one of the good things about Trump, and obviously people will have different views about Donald Trump, but one of the useful things about Donald Trump sometimes that he doesn't really go in for diplomatic norms. So the Americans hate this deal, right? Because it's an American base, effectively, for which they pay us rent, because America spends 4% of its much larger GDP on defense than we do. And it is a critical, irreplaceable base. It's been called Britain's unsinkable aircraft carrier. If we lose it, there is nothing with which we can replace it short of anchoring an American aircraft carrier, or 3 of them, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Right? So America hates this deal. But under Biden, when it became clear that the British government was going to do this, the Americans did what most allies do, which is they pretended to be fine with it because it was a done deal and they didn't want to embarrass their ally, right? And that allowed the government supporters to say, look, the Americans are absolutely fine with this. Of course they're not, because one, while the island is a British territory, we have it forever and it's completely secure, right? What the government is proposing is that effectively we pay Mauritius to take the territory, and then we rent the base. So we give them even more money, right? But crucially, think about this. If the Mauritian government ever decided just to kick us out, would the International Law Brigade stop that happening? No, of course they wouldn't. But the second thing is, Diego Garcia is the largest island and it's the habitable island, but there's a whole archipelago of smaller islands. And the rent only applies to Diego Garcia, which means that actually the Chinese, who are very involved with the government in Mauritius, they could put up listening posts on any of the other islands. They could monitor the comings and goings of whatever was in that base. You lose the advantages of having a very remote base like that. So the Americans are enormously concerned, and Donald Trump, unlike President Joe Biden, has been prepared to say so. Now, I think the open question is, would the Americans ultimately allow the base to transfer sovereignty like this? Donald Trump is talking about annexing Gaza. I would not be surprised personally, and I wouldn't blame him if we signed this insane deal, if he simply announced an American annexation of the territory, right? Because they've got Guam, they've got other territories around the world, because this is a vitally important bit of the Western global security network that we are paying to give away.
Isn't this symbolically and also literally, basically, if this happens, this scenario where the Britain is basically just giving it away and then the Americans come and take over, basically there's a symbolism of the British Empire actually has stopped now, even soft power, then it has been replaced by the American Empire, because the Americans are basically just taking over the places that we should still be responsible for, but we're giving it up. So the word empire, people always misunderstand it, but in terms of the world order, essentially, the Americans are there. But you mentioned the rent money. Is this about because there's a lot of speculations about what the Labour government is actually doing about the story that £18 billion cost could be to the UK. So we're going to give the islands away and also pay them. Obviously, the government officials seem to be all over the place. There's half of them are saying we can't confirm this. The other half have denied it. Is that related to what you explained?
So, in terms of the empire point, I mean, history repeats, first as tragedy, then as farce, and this is Suez as farce, I suppose. If Suez was the tragedy, because again, this is not Britain trying and failing because of its changing political position to hold on to something it could never have held on to. This is a territory which we could hold very easily and are actively choosing to give away because we are governed by maybe the last group of people who really genuinely believe, to the point of not even understanding it properly, in the rules-based international order. Obviously, as I said earlier, they're not actually following the rules, but it's a national embarrassment. That's what it is. On the rent, I mean, it's extraordinary because originally, of course, the Mauritians were sort of saying, "Oh, we don't think this is enough cash," and I was like, "Well, okay, it'd be really funny if Starmer was bending over backwards to try and give away this territory, and then the Mauritians were too greedy." But what's effectively happened is it's not 18 billion at once, but they're index linking the rent. So previously, the agreement was 9 billion over, I think, the life of the lease, but that wasn't index linked, which means obviously that rent would be better value for money over time, and instead they're going to index link it so it rises with inflation. It's mad. Like the sums of money we're talking about here, it's because Mauritius is so tiny. It's actually larger than the GDP of Mauritius. That's what we're proposing. Yeah, I'm not even kidding. That's what we're proposing to pay Mauritius. Is actually larger than the entire value of the Mauritian economy.
Yeah.
And we're also apparently we're giving them a veto over our renewal of the lease, which means that they'll get which means that they'll be able to kick us out. But I think the real kicker is, and obviously, if you're doing the hard maths, 18 billion over the life of a lease is not the same thing as 18 billion right now. But if you're a Labour MP, a lot of foreign policy stuff just doesn't cut through since the end of the Cold War in and of itself. I think if Starmer were giving this away for nothing, people like you and I would be really angry about it, and the security establishment would be angry about it, but most voters probably wouldn't care. But if you're a Labour MP who has just voted to maintain the 2-child welfare limit, has just voted to means test the winter fuel allowance, if you're a Labour minister who Rachel Reeves has just told to go and find 5% cuts, right, to your department on top of everything else. You're a Labour MP, you've just been elected, you've got the largest parliamentary majority your party has ever had, and you're stuck in austerity. And then you see the government committing £18 billion to basically the Attorney General's weird fixation. I mean, what's that going to? How do you defend that, right? Because that's the danger for the government here. No, most voters probably won't care about Chagos in its own merits, right? Because foreign policy seldom comes through. But you paid 18 billion to get rid of a base whilst there's a cost of living crisis, whilst you're cutting welfare, while you're means testing the personal allowance. That is a deeply toxic story for the government.
I would like to at the end go back to Rachel Reeves. You mentioned something interesting, but before we do that, based on your own assessment, it's difficult for us to completely judge because we're not in the room when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to decisions from Foreign Office and everything else. But the way it comes across, what is our relationship with China? Like, and specifically the UK, but UK-US, because at times, publicly speaking, you've had Rishi Sunak having his own views, which is, oh, they're just a competitor, partner. We've had some others saying, no, they are an enemy. Like Trump would probably see them as more aggressive, but still will deal with them. Because it doesn't seem to be a Cold War situation publicly like with the Soviet Union, but we're not really friends. So what do you think the people in charge of Foreign Office, for example, Cabinet Office, Downing Street, obviously Pentagon, the White House, how do they actually see China? Do they see it as just an annoying partner, or are we keeping them close because they're an enemy? Or are we actually do you think we're doing something against them behind their back, like a Cold War situation?
Well, it's not as you say, it's not as overt as during the Cold War, because there was a very real sense that, the Soviet Union especially, but also Mao's China, they were actively exporting revolution overseas, and the Soviet Union occupied half of the European continent and had an awful lot of tanks aimed at the other half, right? That was very much a sort of explicit, never quite declared global war for the future of the world. China is less like that now, because while it's still a one-party state in many respects, it's less obviously an ideological challenger to the US, and its objectives are narrower. and also more effective, right? Like China's realized that instead of sponsoring Maoist revolutionaries across Africa, it can just buy it, which is what it's doing. In terms of British policy, especially, it's honestly just really confused because we have a terrible economy. We've had a terrible economy, honestly, for decades, right? Like, it's all very well talking about, the impact of Brexit or austerity or anything, but this country's on the key metrics, productivity, per capita GDP, real wages, this country's been more or less flat for about 20 years. And if you go all the way back to the crash and then you read the journalism from the crash, you'll see actually we were faking prosperity then with household debt and easy mortgages. So we haven't had a properly functioning economy for ages. And China has a lot of capital, which it is prepared to use to make foreign direct investment. So any government like this one looking for growth, that's always tempting. On the other hand, the reason that we passed the National Security and Investment, the last Conservative government, passed the National Security and Investment Bill, is that China is basically infamous for IP theft, right? Like it steals technology from other countries because its R&D isn't necessarily up where the West is. Britain is still very good at R&D. We're not very good at turning those R&D into big companies because they will go to America, but we're still quite good at R&D. China, very sort of assertive about the way that it steals information. There's big concerns about the fact that the new Chinese super embassy, which the government has short-circuited the planning system to approve, actually is very close to a load of underground, highly sensitive information cable lines, which can only be hacked physically. So the government is exempting Chinese, I think it's literally Chinese intelligence operatives from some of the high-level stuff that the government is bringing in. So it's always, on the one hand, you've got the sort of Cold Warrior types who are like, we should kick China out, we should kick out Huawei, we definitely shouldn't have Huawei involved in delivering government infrastructure projects. China's going to invade Taiwan at some point. That's going to be a real kind of decision point for a lot of the West. And on the other hand, you've got the governments that are just desperate for growth, any growth that they can get. And if that means sucking up to China and getting Chinese cash, then all the better. But of course, the danger is, China is not a Western economy. I know it's less overtly communist now in many respects than it used to be, but every single major Chinese company has governmental involvement, right? They might not be taking orders day to day from the Chinese government, but they will take any order they're given from the Chinese government. And what we've seen in places like Africa is that China will build something like a port on credit, and then when the country can't pay it back, it ends up owning the port, right? And it's doing that all over the place. So China has a very specific strategy of using its economic might to buy power and influence in other countries. And we need to be very careful about that.
They're doing the same thing in Iran, because a lot of people are saying, why is it good that China is not publicly doing the whole axis of support for Iran with Russia? They don't really get involved to fight America. They don't need to, because they're buying out chunks of Iran, the infrastructure. So whether Islamic Republic wins or loses, then China will still be there anyway. But a lot of people go back to mentioning the first mistake, Bill Clinton, 1992, shaking hands with Chinese leaders, thinking, we're going to introduce free market capitalism to you guys, and then you're going to be like us. Well, that didn't go well, because they just copied and pasted a certain model of capitalism or state corporatism. But then we did the same thing again from the UK's perspective in 2011-12, when we sent Cameron, Osborne and Boris Johnson. Do you think that was a mistake?
Yeah, I think so. Because ultimately, at least you need to choose, right? Like, there is a world in which we accept that there is a multipolar world. We accept that China's probably going to be nicking our tech. We think the money is worth it. Psychologically, that means accepting that you're a second or third tier country, but you've at least made the decision, right? But we don't. We instead slalom. We adopt these strident postures about defending the Western democratic order, the global democratic order, and the commitment to Taiwan. We insist on having a ship doing freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, just one. On the other hand, as you say, we go and we cozy up to the Chinese whenever we need investment. I think in 1992, in that sort of very optimistic period after the end of the Cold War, Russia looked like it might become a normal country, and I think the hope with China is that it would become a bit like what Vietnam has become, because Vietnam, still officially a communist country, still definitely a one-party dictatorship, but grading on that curve, broadly fine. It's not
ideological. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
not particularly ideological. It's not threatening its neighbors. The one big foreign intervention that Vietnam has done since the communists won there was actually great because it kicked the Khmer Rouge out of Cambodia, and it's safe. And I think that was hopefully the model. But the problem with China is it's
Mm,
vastly bigger. It carries a lot of baggage, and it still conceives of itself as a great power. Because and
mm.
you can see why. Because if you exclude Mongolia, which is territorially huge, but obviously like in terms of population insignificant, China
Hmm.
still basically has the same territory that it had under the Qing
Yeah,
before World War One, right? Like
yeah,
China is one of the great 19th century empires that is somehow still here,
yeah,
and it runs itself that way. You can see that in Xinjiang, you can see that in Tibet, and obviously it has territorial ambitions towards Taiwan. And
yeah,
Xi Jinping has indicated that he would be open. He has at least tasked the Chinese military with having a plan for
yeah,
taking Taiwan by force. So
yeah.
yeah, normalizing China's role in the international order was always going to be incredibly difficult, and if it was even possible, we did fail.
Yeah, I think it's beyond just the cozying up or trying to be naive, I guess, even in the 90s or 2011, 2012, in terms of partnership, trade. But it seems like, I know it's difficult to kind of, it's ridiculous to simplify it and kind of compare it to like real life, like sort of real life. It is real life, but more like clashes between businesses or neighborhoods. But I think that the other problem that it feels it was a wrong decision was when China basically was so open to certain people like Michel Barnier when he was in the French government, Anthony Fauci, obviously top of the US establishment, when these guys got involved to use, for example, labs in Wuhan, in China. Obviously, Barnier gave the green light on behalf of the French government. It feels like you are literally trusting that the person who you shouldn't trust. They say, yeah, come to our house. You could do your experiments here or do whatever you want. You're investing into us. It feels like, well, now they got things on us. So it feels like the French government, for example, or the US can't really go and expose China completely or like threaten them because China will, for example, have dirty things on you. They could leak saying, well, you guys did this, for example. I'm not saying like some sort of conspiracy theory did dodgy things, but even the basic concept of the Westerners investing in like experiments and labs and things like that. How deeper can it go? Like in terms of them having things on the West, right?
Oh yeah, obviously I can't speak to whether or not they've got stuff specifically on
Yeah,
on the labs, but the most obvious one is just the sheer volume of U.S. government debt that the Chinese own, right?
that's the other one. Yeah.
Like that is an enormous, quiet amount of economic power that Beijing has effectively acquired on the open market, and it therefore, America, for all that Trump talks tough about tariffs and so on, there would be a really steep cost if America got serious about a trade war with China. I think the other problem with regards to Western politicians getting involved with China is that, in many ways, functionally, China is still kind of a monarchy. It's not the sun takes over kind of monarchy, but the president has enormous personal power. You can buy the book of Xi Jinping Thought, right, on the Mao model, and that means that even if you have, for a period of time, a Chinese presidency and a Chinese government, which is perhaps relatively sincerely committed to normalizing relations with the world, attracting Western investment and collaborating with the West, you've got no guarantee that that will survive a change in leadership at the top. And that, I think, is what's happened with China
Yeah.
to an extent, is that Xi Jinping does have very different positions on some things to his predecessors. And obviously, if you're talking about long term, either commercial investments or strategic alliances, that is a very, very difficult position to be in, because it means that actually you've got no long term guarantee that the China you're doing a deal with today is the China that you will have suddenly got a deal with in 20 years' time. When, as you say, they could have all of this stuff on you, either economic or potentially if you've been collaborating on commercially or intelligence sensitive
Yeah.
material. So it is a real problem.
Yeah, finally, taking you back to British politics, you mentioned Rachel Reeves and this government. Even they've ordered the other departments to make cuts. It's a very stupid question. Isn't the same thing that happened in 2010 with George Osborne? Why is the media and all the other liberal left wingers not shouting about austerity like they did? Where are the mass protests?
I think for now, partly it is because there's a Nixon to China element to this, right? Like Tories doing cuts is one thing, Labour doing cuts. Everyone knows they don't want to. So maybe there must be good reasons, but I think a protest will come. The other point is they're not branding it the same way, right? The Tory government in 2010, it made a point of austerity, partly because it got a mandate for it, right? Like Cameron and Osborne spent 2 years talking this up, and that meant that the voters, when they voted for the Conservatives in 2010, kind of knew what they were voting for. And I think that's the thing that might actually end up, for all that, as you say, the government's having a slightly easier time of it now. That might be what ends up doing for Labour, because no matter how angry you, obviously there were left-wing voters who never voted for the Conservatives, hated austerity, but for a lot of voters, that's why the Conservatives got a majority in 2015. They were like, well, look, I might not have liked austerity, but I voted for it, or at least the government was honest with me about doing it. This government was elected on a manifesto with nothing in it, and the vibe was like, everything's fine. Everything's fine. All we'll do is we'll get rid of the Tories, and all the growth buttons that the evil Tories have refused to press because they're Tories, we'll press them, and then there'll be growth. And then they got in and realised that was nonsense. And so now people are getting austerity despite not having voted for it and not being warned about it. And I suspect that by, currently, the thing to take away from this, Rachel Reeves claims that she has set out her spending plans for the entire Parliament.
Yeah.
Right? Now, she has front-loaded all of the spending for the first 2.5 years. And then she claims there'll be 2.5 years with very little spending. Now, you and I know, we remember austerity. If you're a government that's going to do any form of spending restraint in a parliament, you do it at the beginning. You do it at the beginning, you hope it pays off, and then the year before an election, that's when you splurge. Rachel Reeves is asking us to believe that she's going to go into an election after having spent 2.5 years on austerity. No. Dame Louise Casey's social care report is coming in 2028. That's going to have some very expensive commitments that Labour's going to have to make. It's going to have to go into the next election either lying about taxes or on a platform of increasing taxes or on a platform of more cuts. So, Rachel Reeves is. I feel a bit sorry for her in a way because, but not that much, because they should have seen this was coming. The books were open. The 20 billion black hole was fake. There was about 6 billion of it that was perhaps actually unexplained. They've got no plan. And I think they've missed their chance to really go for growth, because the big things that could deliver growth, building stuff, right? Housing, railways, power plants. Now they've done some good stuff on power plants recently. Rachel Reeves re-announced a load of reservoirs that had already been agreed recently, but it's been 6 or 7 months, right? Like housing, they really had to do in the King's Speech, because if you just think about the process of getting houses built. You change the law, it takes a year to change the law. You then spend a year dragging local councils around until they agree to actually allow some stuff to be built. Then you have to get spades in the ground. There's not enough time. So I genuinely don't think that they're going to get growth, this parliament, serious growth. And I think that that's going to put them in a really awful position.
Yes, absolutely. When you mentioned Labour would say, well, when we do austerity, it's different. It reminds me of towards the end of the Tory governments when they said, when we raise taxes, it's different too, and Labour does it. Still way around.
Drove me absolutely mad, right? Like Rishi Sunak said, I'm a tax-cutting conservative while he froze income tax threshold.
Brilliant. Well, on that lovely note, the future is going to be doom and gloomy. Thank you so much, Henry Hill of A Conservative Home, for coming on the show. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.